White designer mocked black tailor's skills, then saw his work on the runway. The first time Nathaniel Cross met Jeremiah Cole, it was in the unassuming backroom of a small tailoring shop tucked between a coffeehouse and an antique bookstore in the quieter part of the city. Nathaniel had been sent there, much against his will, by his assistant, who insisted that the upcoming fashion show for his new line required some authentic, handcrafted suit work that only a traditional tailor could provide. Nathaniel, who prided himself on being a modern designer with a flair for the dramatic and an eye for sleek minimalism, had scoffed at the idea. "Tailoring is outdated," he had told her on the drive over, tapping his phone impatiently as she navigated the traffic. "It's a lost art, a relic. We're in the era of innovation, not Grandpa's sewing machine." But when they arrived and Nathaniel stepped inside, he found Jeremiah bent over a long wooden table, stitching a lapel with a focus so intense it seemed he hadn't noticed the bell above the door ring. The shop smelled faintly of cedar and fabric chalk, and the afternoon sun slanted in through the window, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Jeremiah, tall and lean, with skin the color of polished walnut and eyes that spoke of quiet determination, finally looked up, his hands still holding the needle mid-stitch. "You must be the designer," Jeremiah said, his voice deep but even, betraying neither excitement nor intimidation. Nathaniel gave a thin smile, the kind that suggested he was already unimpressed. "That's right, Nathaniel Cross. I have a show in 2 weeks and I need a few pieces tailored. My assistant insists you're the best." His eyes scanned the room with mild disdain, lingering on the old sewing machines, the rolls of fabric stacked haphazardly on the shelves, the faded photos on the wall. "Though I have to say, this place feels a little behind the times." Jeremiah's brow lifted just slightly, but he didn't rise to the bait. "Quality doesn't age," he replied simply, and set down the jacket he'd been working on. "Why don't you tell me what you need?" What followed was a conversation laced with subtle tension. Nathaniel described his vision: clean lines, bold cuts, the kind of pieces that made headlines. But each time Jeremiah suggested a practical adjustment for fit or movement, Nathaniel waved it off as unnecessary or too old-fashioned. "I'm not looking for comfort," Nathaniel finally said, his tone dripping with impatience. "I'm looking for impact. People don't talk about how a suit feels, they talk about how it looks." Jeremiah studied him for a long moment before responding, his voice measured but firm. "If it doesn't feel right, it will never truly look right. Clothes have to move with a person, not against them. A good tailor knows how to make that happen." Nathaniel let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You tailors think you're magicians. In reality, you're just mechanics of cloth. I'm the one who creates the art, you just tinker with the nuts and bolts." There was a flicker in Jeremiah's eyes then, something that could have been irritation or perhaps quiet amusement, but he didn't let it grow into a full expression. Instead, he reached for his tape measure and said, "Stand still. I'll take your measurements. You'll have your suits in 5 days." Over the next week, Nathaniel barely thought about the tailor again. He was busy overseeing fittings, coordinating models, finalizing music for the show, and dealing with a last-minute venue issue. His assistant, however, kept quietly reporting that Jeremiah was working late into the night, and that his precision was almost obsessive. Nathaniel dismissed it with a shrug. As long as the pieces look good under the lights, that's all that matters. When the suits arrived, neatly hung and protected in garment bags, Nathaniel barely glanced at them before sending them off to the model's dressing area. It wasn't until the night of the dress rehearsal that he saw Jeremiah's work in motion for the first time. The model stepped out onto the runway for a lighting test, wearing one of the tailored jackets. Even in the half-lit space, There was something about the way the fabric draped over her frame, the way the seams seemed to guide her movement instead of restrain it, that made Nathaniel pause mid-sentence. It was fluid, alive, almost like the jacket was telling its own story as she walked. He caught himself staring, then quickly masked it with his usual critical eye. "Fine," he muttered to himself. "It's a fine." But somewhere deep inside, a seed of curiosity had been planted, though Nathaniel would never admit it. Not yet. The morning of the final fitting arrived with a restless energy in the air, the kind that comes when the clock ticks a little too loudly toward an important moment. Nathaniel strode into the backstage area of the venue, his coffee in one hand, phone in the other, rattling off a list of last-minute adjustments to his assistant without even looking up. The models, makeup artists, and stylists moved around like bees in a hive, each in their own frantic orbit. The air thick with the scent of hairspray, fabric steam, and the faint metallic tang of stage lights warming up overhead. In the middle of this organized chaos, Jeremiah stood quietly in a corner, his suit jacket unbuttoned, a small leather toolkit at his side. He was watching the models try on the tailored pieces, his sharp eyes following the flow of fabric over every shoulder, waist, and cuff. Every so often, he'd step forward, a piece of chalk in hand, and make the smallest mark, murmuring to the model to relax her arm or shift her weight. Nathaniel noticed him eventually, pausing long enough to take in the image, the calm, deliberate movements, the steady focus. It annoyed him a little how unbothered Jeremiah seemed by the frenzy around them. "You're early," Nathaniel said, stepping up beside him, his tone hovering between polite observation and veiled criticism. "I didn't expect you here until the actual show prep." Jeremiah's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I like to see my work in motion before it meets the audience. A suit can behave differently on a runway than in a quiet shop. The light, the posture, the walk, they can change everything." Nathaniel sipped his coffee, unimpressed. Or maybe it's just clothes and people overthink it. Jeremiah didn't answer right away. He was watching one of the male models walk toward the stage, the crisp lines of the suit catching the light in a way that almost seemed deliberate. "People don't remember fabric," he said at last, still looking forward. "They remember the way it made them feel powerful, graceful, confident. That's the difference between a garment and a statement." Nathaniel let out a short laugh. "You sound like you're giving a TED Talk for tailors." The model came back, and Jeremiah stepped forward to adjust the lapel with a gentle, precise tug, then stood back again. "I'm giving no talk," he said evenly. "Just making sure your statement doesn't collapse halfway down the runway." That jab caught Nathaniel off guard. He opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could, his assistant appeared, holding a clipboard and looking exasperated. "Nathaniel, we have a problem. One of the jackets for the opening look has a tear in the lining. If we don't fix it before tonight, it's gonna bunch under the lights, and the cameras will pick it up." Nathaniel groaned, muttering something under his breath. "Fine, I'll call the backup supplier." "No time," Jeremiah interjected, already holding out his hand. "Where is it?" Nathaniel blinked. "You think you can fix it here? Backstage?" Jeremiah gave him a look that said the question was almost insulting. "I can fix it anywhere, but the sooner you hand it to me, the sooner you can stop worrying." There was a pause, just long enough for Nathaniel to feel the weight of the choice, before he handed over the garment. Jeremiah pulled a small roll of silk thread from his kit. The color so perfectly matched it was as though he had known this exact emergency would occur. In less than 10 minutes, the tear was gone, the lining lying flat and invisible to even the closest inspection. Nathaniel inspected the repair, his fingers running over the seam. "Not bad," he admitted reluctantly. for something done in a corner. Perfection doesn't care where it's made, Jeremiah replied simply, already packing away his tools. Nathaniel walked away, shaking his head, but there was an odd sense of unease in him now, as though he'd just seen a glimpse of something he couldn't quite dismiss, no matter how much he wanted to. What Nathaniel didn't know yet was that this wasn't the last time Jeremiah would step in quietly and turn a potential disaster into a seamless triumph. And by the time the actual show began, Nathaniel would be looking at his mechanic of cloth in a very different light. By the afternoon of the show, the venue had transformed into a living organism. Every hallway and backstage corner humming with life, every voice layered over the next until the entire space felt like it was vibrating with anticipation. Outside, guests were already beginning to gather. Fashion editors with eyes sharp enough to slice a poorly sewn hem in half, influencers adjusting their angles in the reflection of tinted windows, and buyers whispering numbers behind glossy programs. Inside, the models stood like statues in their assigned garments, waiting for their turn to step into the glaring white light of the runway. Nathaniel had stationed himself near the stage entrance, his clipboard now abandoned in favor of pacing with his arms crossed, scanning every detail like a hawk that hadn't eaten in weeks. He wanted perfection, needed it, in fact, because this was the collection meant to cement his place in the industry's upper tier. He had fought too hard, spent too much money, and silenced too many doubters to let a single misstep ruin the night. It was in the middle of that feverish tension that Nathaniel saw him again. Jeremiah, leaning against a rack of spare garments, his toolkit open at his feet, a spool of black thread balanced effortlessly in one hand. Unlike everyone else, Jeremiah didn't seem infected by the panic in the air. He was moving through it the way a stone sits in the middle of a rushing stream, still unshaken, but undeniably shaping the current. Nathaniel approached him, partly out of irritation, partly because he couldn't seem to help himself. "You don't have a role here after the fittings are done," he said, his voice low, as though trying to reclaim control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers. "Why are you still backstage?" Jeremiah's gaze flicked to him, calm but not dismissive. "Because the show hasn't happened yet. Clothes have a way of changing under pressure. A seam pops, a button loosens, a stitch gives way. You think it's ready, but then someone takes 3 steps under the lights, and everything shifts." Nathaniel exhaled sharply through his nose. "You're implying my designs are unstable?" "I'm implying," Jeremiah said, his voice measured, "that even the most beautiful structure can fall if the foundation is weak. I don't plan on letting that happen tonight." Nathaniel wanted to argue, but before he could, a commotion broke out near the lineup area. One of the models, a tall woman in a fitted cream jacket, was holding her arm awkwardly away from her side, as though she were afraid to move it. The assistant rushed over and came back with wide eyes. "The seam under the arm ripped," she said in a voice that was more like a hiss than a whisper. "It's right before she walks, Nathaniel. Cameras are already set." Nathaniel's pulse spiked. A tear in the opening act's outfit could mean humiliation before the show even found its rhythm. "Get another jacket," he said quickly, but his assistant shook her head. "That's the centerpiece look. There is no other." And before Nathaniel could so much as curse under his breath, Jeremiah was already walking toward the model, rolling up his sleeves. "Hold your arm just like that," he instructed her, pulling a curved needle from his kit. The thread flashed briefly under the harsh backstage lights before disappearing into the fabric. His hands moved with the kind of economy that came from decades of repetition, the repair both invisible and unhurried despite the clock ticking down to seconds. When he stepped back, the jacket looked untouched, as if it had never known the insult of a tear. "Go," Jeremiah said quietly to the model, and she walked out into the flood of cameras and music without a trace of the backstage disaster. Nathaniel caught himself staring again, that same feeling from the dress rehearsal tightening in his chest. There was something infuriating about how easily Jeremiah fixed problems that could have sunk months of work. Something infuriating and something unsettlingly admirable. "You're making me look like I needed you tonight," Nathaniel muttered, half joking, half defensive. Jeremiah met his eyes with an expression that was both kind and unyielding. "You don't need me," he said. "Your designs will still be yours. I just make sure they survive long enough to be remembered." Nathaniel didn't reply. He just stood there for a moment, watching as the opening look lit up the runway and the audience's murmur turned into a ripple of applause. What he didn't realize, not yet, was that by the end of the night, Jeremiah's quiet work would not only save the show but steal it entirely. The show was already halfway through when the atmosphere in the venue shifted. It wasn't a sudden change, no gasp from the audience or crash of music, but more like a slow, rising tide. The murmurs in the front row turned into attentive silence. The photographers, who had been snapping rhythmically like typewriters, began to hold their frames longer before clicking. Even the models seemed to walk with an extra layer of confidence, as though the air around them had thickened into something electric. Nathaniel noticed it from his post at the side of the runway. His eyes, trained to read the audience like a gambler watches a table, picked up every subtle cue. The way a critic in the second row leaned forward slightly, the quiet exchange of glances between two buyers in the corner. Whatever was happening, it was good, better than he had expected. And then the seventh look came out. It was a charcoal gray suit, sharp, lean, the kind of cut that whispered authority without ever needing to raise its voice. Nathaniel had designed it himself, yes, but as it moved under the lights, there was something different about it, something he hadn't planned. The fabric didn't just drape. It flowed, like it was shaping itself to the model's every step in real time. The light caught the seams in a way that framed her silhouette, not just fitting her but amplifying her presence. It was the difference between a portrait and a living person, the difference between seeing an image and feeling it breathe. Nathaniel's assistant leaned toward him, her voice low but urgent. "That's one of the ones Jeremiah worked on more than the rest." He changed the inner structure of the jacket. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He didn't like the idea of someone altering his vision without asking. "Changed it how?" "Something about the shoulder line and the armhole. I didn't catch the details. But look at it." She gestured toward the runway, where the suit had just earned a flash storm from the cameras. Nathaniel looked, and though he'd rather be caught dead than admit it, he saw it too. The garment wasn't simply being worn. It was in conversation with the person wearing it, shaping her walk, commanding the room. It was the kind of detail that even the audience couldn't explain, but they felt it. Backstage, Jeremiah stood in his usual quiet place, hands clasped loosely behind his back, watching as the model disappeared into the wings. He caught Nathaniel's gaze briefly and gave a nod that was neither smug nor apologetic. Just a simple acknowledgement, as if to say, "This is what it's supposed to be." The next look and the next after that carried the same subtle magic. The movements were easier, the drape more forgiving, the presence stronger. It wasn't flashy, but it was undeniable. Nathaniel began to feel an odd mix of emotions. Pride, for the way his collection was landing. Irritation, that the improvements were not solely his doing. And something harder to name, a kind of begrudging respect that was beginning to press against his carefully maintained ego. It was during the penultimate look that disaster nearly struck again. One of the male models, a towering figure in a deep navy overcoat, caught his sleeve on a backstage fixture just before stepping out. The tear was clean but glaring, right along the edge of the cuff, a death sentence under runway lights. Nathaniel's heart plummeted. Before he could even issue an order, Jeremiah was already there. He didn't kneel, didn't fuss, didn't even ask for space. His fingers worked in rapid, precise motions, the needle darting in and out like a secret being whispered into the fabric. It was done so quickly the model never lost his cue. He stepped out only seconds later, and the overcoat looked as if it had been untouched since it left the workroom. Nathaniel felt a strange heat in his chest as he watched. It wasn't just relief. It was the dawning realization that this man, this quiet, steady tailor he had mocked not even 2 weeks ago, had saved him more times tonight than he could count. The final look, the closing statement of the show, walked out to a wave of applause that began before the model even reached the end of the runway. By the time she turned and made her way back, the applause had grown into a standing ovation. Nathaniel stepped out briefly to take his bow, the flashes blinding, the music swelling. And yet, as he stood there soaking in the praise, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. How much of this applause belongs to me, and how much belongs to him? Nathaniel didn't know it yet, but the answer to that question would be waiting for him in the unlikeliest place, and in front of the people who mattered most. The after-party was held in the atrium of a luxury hotel, a glass-walled, chandelier-lit expanse filled with the scent of champagne and the murmur of voices that had already begun rewriting the night into legend. Nathaniel had been swept into a blur of congratulations, interviews, and promises of new collaborations. Every time he turned around, another hand was extended, another compliment offered. Yet, beneath the glitter of success, his thoughts kept drifting to the man who had kept the seams of his triumph from unraveling. Jeremiah was nowhere in sight, no doubt already gone, having slipped away before the cameras could catch him. Nathaniel wasn't sure whether that irritated him or disappointed him. The next morning brought the reviews. Nathaniel sat at his desk, coffee cooling beside him, scanning headlines on his laptop. A masterclass in modern menswear. Cross redefines minimalism for the new decade. The words thrilled him, but then his eyes caught on a photograph in one of the spreads. It was from the moment before the 7th look hit the runway. There, just behind the curtain, barely lit, was Jeremiah, adjusting the collar of the model's suit with the care of someone tuning a violin before a concert. The caption didn't name him, but the sharp-eyed could see the intent in his face, the precision in his fingers. Nathaniel leaned back, staring at that image. It was infuriating in a way, the idea that this man, whom he had dismissed and even mocked, might have left fingerprints on the very heart of his show. And then, 3 days later, came the real shock. A high-profile fashion house in Paris, one Nathaniel had tried and failed to impress in the past, unveiled their upcoming campaign. The lead piece? A suit cut with an elegance and fluidity unmistakable to anyone who had seen Jeremiah's work. The press release named the new head of their bespoke department, Jeremiah Cole. Nathaniel's phone lit up with messages from industry peers. "Isn't this the tailor you worked with? Looks like you trained him well." Others were less kind. "Guess someone else stole the spotlight? Huh?" But the final blow came when he saw the Paris runway photos. There was Jeremiah, standing off to the side of the stage, watching models glide past in garments that bore his invisible signature, that perfect fusion of form and movement. Cameras were turned on him now, the quiet man no longer in the shadows. Nathaniel felt something complex rise in him. Part bitterness, part awe, part something he didn't quite have the courage to name. Weeks later, they crossed paths again, this time at an international fashion gala. Jeremiah was in a tailored 3-piece suit the color of midnight, the fit so precise it seemed to have been shaped by moonlight itself. Nathaniel approached, glass in hand. "I see Paris treated you well," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Jeremiah smiled faintly. "They respect the craft. That's all I've ever wanted." There was a pause, the kind that felt like the folding of 2 years' worth of unsent letters. Nathaniel broke it first. For what it's worth, I underestimated you. Badly. Jeremiah inclined his head, accepting without gloating. It happens. Sometimes people don't see past the surface until the light hits from the right angle. Nathaniel raised his glass in a quiet salute. To the right angle, then. They clinked glasses. Not friends, not rivals, but two craftsmen who, for a moment, understood each other without needing another word. Somewhere in the background, a photographer captured the moment. The celebrated designer and the once-mock tailor standing side by side, both wearing suits that told their own stories. And though Nathaniel would go on to create many more collections, he would never again look at a stitch, a seam, or a drape without thinking of the man who had taught him, without ever saying the words,